Thanks to everyone who's here for joining our second workshop on stress and ALS. We are thrilled to provide this free series to you in partnership with the ALS Association Upstate New York chapter. These are sponsored workshops by Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma America, and we are so grateful for their support. Today is our second webinar in the caregiver portion of the Stress and ALS series. If you are attending this live, please know that there is a webinar from last week that provided some context to what I'll discuss today, although I'll do my best to recap what was discussed, but that will be available to watch via your ALS chapter after the series wraps up. If you are watching a recording of this, I recommend going back and watching workshop number 1 in this series. And just a reminder that there is a third and final week in this series taking place next week. So if you haven't signed up, be sure to do so. We will be providing, also as a reminder, a patient portion of this workshop in early 2021 for ALS patients living in upstate New York. That series will similarly explore the topic of mindful stress management, but will address patient-specific stressors and solutions. And lastly, for those who are attending live tonight, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions at any time, and I will answer them at the end. It's the little thing with 2 little speech bubbles at the bottom that says Q&A. So if a question pops into your mind during our conversation tonight, you can always enter it at any time, like I said, or we will come to those questions and answers at the end of tonight's presentation. So let's go ahead and get started with today's workshop. So for those who were not here last week, just a little bit about me before getting into this. My name is Martel Catalano, and I'm the co-founder and the director of Beyond My Battle. We are a nonprofit organization also based in upstate New York that provides emotional support and educational resources to both patients and caregivers. We support this community in managing the inherent stressors that come with having or caring for someone with an illness or a disability through things like support groups, interactive resources, and workshops like this one tonight. Today's workshop is all about identifying your personal stress profile. That means taking a look at what might be your individual signs of stress, both physical and behavioral, as well as what might be uniquely triggering for you. Then we're going to touch on what the stress profile of your loved one with ALS might be. We're not going to spend a ton of time there because, again, we do have that portion of the series coming in 2021, but it is important to definitely consider. And we talked towards the end of last week's workshop about pro-social stress, so putting ourselves in their shoes, which can be really difficult to do, but necessary if we want to establish the connection of being a supportive caregiver. So we'll touch on that. And then lastly, today we will talk a bit about just common expectations and assumptions and how they might get in the way of supporting our loved one. Next week, we will bring everything from this series together and learn about stress management practices for caregivers and mindful communication with our loved one. So last week we talked about caregiver burnout and the vicious cycle of stress that wreaks havoc on our body and our mind, and especially our relationships. We talked about how we can't start to manage our stress until we know when we are stressed and understand why. That when we see that, really what we see on the surface is often just a sliver of what's going on underneath the surface. So we had that analogy of the iceberg last week for those of you who were here for that. We act or talk, or conversely, we might not act or not talk in certain ways that are a result of built up stressors underneath the surface, from emotions like fear and frustration to social and financial strains of caregiving. There is definitely a lot going on. So getting to a calmer place and getting more control of our stress requires us to make connections between what we see on the surface and what's below it. But getting super familiar with what is on the surface, our physical responses to stress and our behaviors that we exhibit when we're stressed, is the first place that we want to start before like diving below to those triggers and emotional stuff that's down there. So like it says here, working on identifying our specific physical and behavioral signs is really what the first place we want to start when we get to know our own stress profile. And then from there we can, like I said, dive deeper into identifying what sets off our stress. So we're going to do that. We're going to do that tonight. So part of our stress profile is the physical signs that we have when we're stressed. So remembering back to last week when we talked about how stress is very natural, it's a very natural human response that we all need, and it has direct connection to our body. It would be great if there was a quick universal fix for stress, right? But even things like deep breathing or going outside for a walk or exercising for stress reduction require us to become embodied. They require us to feel a physical sensation and either use it or transform it. And each of us has different stress, have stress present itself in our bodies in different ways. I know that as I feel like there is like a brick in my stomach when I am really stressed. I know that I get sleepy. I know that my shoulders get tense, but my best friend gets nauseous and she can't fall asleep. So it's really different for each and every one of us. So identifying our physical stress signs is the number one place to start, because it's likely that we already know them pretty well, right? It's likely that we've picked up on our physical stress signs at least sometime in the past. So let's just take a brief moment to ask ourselves some questions about how our bodies respond to stress. It doesn't have to be in the stressful moment. It can be afterwards. So it might not be an immediate response that we have when we're like under immense amounts of stress, but it might be that feeling of like burnout or the headaches or whatever happens maybe in the following hours, days, sometimes even weeks. It might be a more prolonged one. So just ask ourselves right now, taking a moment to think, like maybe, do I lie in bed unable to fall asleep? Do I feel run down or tired after even getting a full night's sleep? Do I frequently get stomach issues or constipation? Do I lack an appetite? Just things that we all might have that are a little different from one another. I'm just taking another second to reflect on that. Sometimes I like to write these down. This is a practice that we often work on. If I had more time, we would kind of really do a writing exercise around this. But if you find that you want to revisit this later, it might be great to do this with a pen and paper. But let's move on. So next we can start to reflect on and consider what our stress behaviors are, or the actions that we exhibit when we are stressed. So keep in mind, this may be a lack of action, a shutdown response as seen in some of the examples here, like avoiding people or neglecting self-care. So just because it's not a big extroverted behavior, or it's the absence of behavior entirely, doesn't exclude it as a behavioral sign of stress. That's very much common. So one that I find is common among caregivers that I wanted to point out is the over planning or seeking control. So when something is so out of our control, like our loved one's disease, we can go into hyper control mode or hyper planning mode. This might be just general OCD like behaviors, or it could just be controlling other things about our lives, like diet or taking on way too many extracurricular activities to feel a sense of control within something, right? So this connects to the last thing on this list here, which is which I have experienced so much in my own life, but it is having having other problems or creating other problems that can act as a distraction. So adding more to our plates, spreading ourselves too thin, means distracting ourselves from the unfixable thing. So creating these distractions so that we don't have to think about the pain or the guilt or the sadness that we feel for the loved one who has ALS. Stress behaviors are right up there with identifying next to physical stress signs, because while we might be familiar with them already, they often can be kind of sneaky. So by that, I mean they sometimes don't have much to do with what is stressing us out, and that can get confusing. So a classic example is that you're so burnt out from days of caregiving or worrying, and your child or your spouse does something minor, like folds the laundry wrong, and suddenly you're yelling at them, or you're crying or something, and that is why these are so important to detect. So really working from a place of, what are my physical stress signs? First, they could be the most obvious, and then what are my behavioral signs? So again, like, I just want everyone to take a minute or so to ask ourselves about possibly our stress behaviors, just reflecting on, do you turn to temporary stress relievers like drugs or alcohol regularly? Do I snap or yell at people for seemingly unrelated reasons? Do I overextend or isolate myself? I'm just taking a moment to think. And again, if you're rewatching this or rethinking about this later, maybe jotting these things down. Great. Let's go ahead and move on to our triggers. So this looks like a text heavy slide, and I apologize, but there is good reason for it. So first of all, what are triggers? I could talk a lot on this subject alone for hours, but I'm going to simplify things for the sake of our workshop today. So triggers can honestly be anything. We just went through physical stress signs, behavioral stress signs. Those are kind of like in these categories where it's like, okay, there's common stress behaviors, there's common physical behaviors. Which ones do I exhibit? Cool, moving on. But triggers can really be anything at all. Triggers are so individualized and specific to our lived experience. And what triggers one person could be honestly soothing for another person. So past experiences directly correlate with our triggers. So for instance, your childhood experiences and childhood programming and any traumatic experiences in your life are going to directly dictate the things that set us off later in life. The fact that triggers are more difficult to get to know, and so much more unique to all of us, is why they should be explored, I feel, after getting to know that surface stuff, after getting to know the physical and behavioral stuff, because this is really diving deeper. So triggers are basically anything that creates an emotional response within us, anything that sets off that other stuff. Emotional responses doesn't have to mean like tears, right? It can mean behaviors, just like we discussed. It can mean shutting down entirely or lack of behaviors. It can mean internalized thoughts or self-talk. Emotional responses can take place in our body. We now know that we tense up or get exhausted from emotions, and so on. So someone, classic examples here, like someone who has witnessed abuse in their life might be triggered by spontaneous touch. Someone who grew up in a household with arguing parents might be triggered by loud sounds. Someone who is told that they aren't good enough by their caregivers might be triggered by deadlines or daunting tasks. So just to name a few, as someone with a disability myself, I know that I can be triggered by certain words connoting ableism or assumptions about me. I can get triggered by people offering me help because I fear that I'm burdening them. But more on that in a little bit, kind of looking at that perspective. So for now, here are some examples of common triggers for caregivers. If you feel like it, you can use the Q&A box actually to enter something totally anonymously. Nobody sees anything you enter into the Q&A box but me. But you can, if you feel like entering something that could be triggering for you, it's again completely anonymous, but it could be a good practice to write that down. But being invited to something I have here might trigger anxiety. Oops, sorry about that. As you stress about like the logistics of it or the social challenges around going to the thing, scheduling or going to a medical appointment, maybe that triggers sadness and you just avoid it. These are just completely examples, everyone, but we turn to food or alcohol and drugs, and that's the behavioral response. But what triggered it could be seeing someone you loved struggle. Someone offering you help as a caregiver, that might trigger the controlling things and the over planning and the over scheduling because you don't want help from anybody else. You've got everything under control. And of course, seeing something, we talked a lot last week about grief. So seeing something or thinking about something even that you had planned prior to diagnosis, traveling with your loved one, or the life that you thought you would share. Maybe you watch a movie and it reminds you of something that you talked about doing. That might trigger crying or even yelling, depending on the person, because you feel like you guys were robbed of your future. So these are a little bit more personal. These are a little, obviously way more unique. And like I said, they're going to really pull on our past lived experiences as individuals that make up what triggers us. But this is really where we want to go and really consider after we get to know our specific stress signs. And I'm just going to share an anonymous attendee's response here. It says, after my husband's diagnosis, just seeing an older couple walk hand in hand used to make me cry. Oh, that's so real. And I completely understand that feeling. Thank you so much for sharing. So, identifying our personal stress profile, still talking about this because I wanted to provide an even more in-depth example about triggers specifically and how we get to start to do this process. Like I said, they're not as apparent as like a physical or a behavioral sign. And that's often because they present as something so far from what they really are. Our mind likes to think the source of a problem is way more on the surface, above the iceberg, or above the water level of the iceberg, I should say, than buried deep below it, because that's way harder for us to look at and harder for us to face. But uncovering a trigger is this process that I've kind of illustrated here as just a very simple example, but it's really this practice of reflecting on, it's a practice of reflection during times we feel a stress response arise. So it can be difficult to do this reflection during the stressful time itself. It's not, nobody's expected to do this like in the moment, but the more I like, the more we do this in the aftermath, the more we can begin to actually do it in the moment, which is really cool. I know it can be difficult to reflect during stressful times, but we really, really need to try to identify our real triggers in order to best manage our stress. And I like to think of this like the process of peeling away layers like an onion. So sometimes it takes peeling back a bunch of layers. I think this is like, 3 layers in this example here to uncover a real trigger. But I took this example from one of our ebooks, which is called Becoming a Source of Calm. And everybody who attends these workshops are essentially getting a more in-depth live version of that. So I felt like, let me just take this great example from this book. But This example shows how someone might think their stress is because of something, in this case, being exhausted, when really there's so much more going on. You can, this might be different for you. There's another example in our ebook that shares an example of someone who their problem is they feel like they've gained weight, and yet really, by peeling back layers, it's really that we're not prioritizing ourselves, we're not leaving time for ourselves, because of other various things going on in our lives. But in this case, not getting enough sleep isn't really the true answer here. It's certainly a problem, but the fear over the loved one's worsening health is really what's at the root, at the core, peeled when we peel those layers back. So we can also see that it isn't so much a problem of, say, like not being able to fall asleep in this case, but a problem of overscheduling ourselves. The good thing about peeling back these layers is, even though it can be hard to do and maybe painful to do, we end up typically resolving a lot of the stuff that's on the surface by resolving the underlying stuff. So for this person in the example, working on that fear of witnessing their loved one's worsening health and the behavioral signs of overscheduling themselves so that they become so exhausted, they might want to work on that fear, the fear of the worsening health. So in this person's case, maybe it's finding a mental health professional or a support group or so on that can then, up the line, take care of the overbooking, overscheduling, and then eventually relieve the exhaustion. So if this is confusing, I'm happy to answer questions on it later. But honestly, this process of uncovering a trigger, like I said, can come after the fact. And again, the more and more we do it after the fact of it happening, reflecting back on that scenario or that situation, the more we can step back and have that aha moment. As a result, we might not have as a reactive or a response to it the next time something similar happens. So just moving on now to understanding the stress profile of our loved one with ALS. So we're not going to, perhaps identify all of their stress behaviors and all of their physical stress signs. Again, we might be able to pick up on their behaviors, but unless we're told about the physical signs of their stress, we don't live in their body. We don't know what that's like. But we can talk about our own stress until we are blue in the face. But the truth about caregiver stress, as we know, and like we began to talk about last week, is that it is directly connected to the stress of our loved one. So yes, managing our own stress can help reduce their stress, and not managing our stress often negatively impacts their stress load, but also their personal stress can elevate our personal stress, and so on. So it's a two-way street, and that's why at Beyond My Battle we tend to use the term care partners instead of caregivers, because it's really a partnership with the two people. So we have to talk about the stress of our loved one, really, if we are going to really work on mindfully managing our own stress. As I mentioned, the stress behaviors of our loved one can be the source of our stress, right? We know we have to identify our stressors now in order to manage them. And sometimes that stressor might just be their stress behaviors. So while these behaviors or signs might be like ours, such as, yelling or stomach aches or headaches or lack of motivation or isolation, their triggers and emotions can be really different. We talked about last week that pro-social domain of stress, that empathy, and it can be painful. But leaning into that is going to help us, help inform us as caregivers that what we can do to help them. We're going to talk a lot about communication next week, and that is going to certainly come into play here when we want to understand our loved one's stress, especially someone who has ALS and maybe their communication is in fact quite compromised. How can we how can we pick up on their stress and their stress behaviors, and what can we do for them about it? But for a moment, again, I just want to take this little moment of reflection, and it might feel like we're pushing these feelings away, but I want you to know that this is, of course, this is a safe space and you are supported, and everything that you feel is valid here. But think for a moment about what your loved one's emotional responses or triggers might be. Maybe they don't like being offered help. It could be similar to the trigger of making an appointment because they're afraid of what the results might be. Just thinking for another moment or so what might set your individual loved one off. And thinking as well, what are their physical stress signs? What have they communicated to you, or what have you picked up on physically about them when they're under immense stress, which they might be all the time, right, in this situation? And what kind of behaviors, perhaps, too. And we'll talk a little bit more about this next week as we get into communication. All right. So one thing that I know is so common, and bear with me on this one, but something I hear a lot from both sides, patient and caregiver, is that there are a lot of expectations and assumptions going around. So people say that they expect, patients will say that they expect their caregivers to know how to do things for them in a certain way. Or, sometimes it's like, we just expect people to know exactly what we want. We expect people to be mind readers. And caregivers might say that they expect their loved one to, I don't know, be appreciative, say thank you. It could be anything. And this might be a great moment for you to use that Q&A box too. What are the things that we're guilty of expecting or assuming about our loved one? A lot of the times our expectations are well-intentioned. They really are. And as I was looking for quotes for this slide, it's really clear to me that there are still mixed feelings about expectations overall. I saw one quote that read something like, high expectations are the key to everything, or another that was like, great success comes from great expectations. And, I don't want to sound like a bummer here, but in the mindfulness practice, we typically try to eliminate expectation best we can. The common idea is that expectations can lead to disappointment, or that peace begins where expectation ends. And now I'm not promoting the elimination of every plan or every goal, but expecting things, especially from others. It's one thing to kind of expect things from ourselves, right? But it's a whole other thing to expect things from others, or to expect things out of life in general. I mean, we're living in a time right now where nobody expected that we would be living the way that we are in November of 2020. A year ago, if we had all been shown a picture of what we looked like right now at home wearing masks, we would be so confused. We don't want to assume or expect the future to be any way. And honestly, the more that we can relinquish and release our expectations for life, especially when it comes to other people, we end up in so many ways more present, more happy, and more at peace. And when chaos or challenge or unprecedented times do arise, we're actually better equipped to deal with them. So again, I hope that I don't sound like a major downer here, but the same expectations, assumptions. I think we have all heard the saying, what happens when we assume. So I don't need to illustrate that, but I think, we know we have a better understanding of that. Assumptions maybe are not the best. And I'm here to kind of just remind us that expectations might not be either, especially this is so true in sensitive situations. This is so true in just even rapidly changing or new situations, like a new diagnosis. we need to ask, we need to communicate, and we need to get as clear as we can with the other person if possible. So again, we're going to talk about that in week 3, but I wanted to share an example because I recently spoke with a woman who is a quadriplegic after her diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. And she told me that her and her husband they would get in this argument every Friday night when they would go out to dinner. And at first she wasn't sure why. She then realized that she was angry at him. And she was angry because he was assuming how she liked to eat her food because he was feeding her. And he would put all different food items on one same fork bite and feed them to her. And she likes to eat food separately. And he would feed her faster than she likes to eat because he likes to eat quite quickly. And he didn't ask, and he didn't know to ask because it was so new for them. And so she realized that she had to tell him. And their fighting, when she did, their fighting went away. So this is just kind of like this every day. I mean, not every day for everyone, but perhaps every day for some of you, every day for certain people going through certain mobility issues. We tend to just go about things without maybe asking, without maybe inquiring or getting curious. This element of curiosity here, I think, is key to releasing expectations. So instead of expecting for things to go a certain way or assuming the person wants something in the way that we might want or we think that they would want, getting curious and how do you like your food, or how am I talking too quickly for you? I mean, I know there's a lot of devices commonly used for people living with ALS, like, am I setting this up comfortably for you if that's not being asked, or is this happening too quickly? So that was just one little bit that I definitely wanted to touch on as we're going through stress and we're considering how we interpret stress, how our loved one interprets stress. Having expectations and assumptions can often get in the way, and I encourage everyone to try to release them as best we can. I know it's completely impossible to release expectation altogether. I mean, like, I expect that tomorrow is going to come. I guess maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. There's a lot of expectations that we just naturally have, and it's okay. But I think the more we can release them and the more we can kind of that term "let go" is so often used, but I actually try to swap that out as most I can with "let be." So just letting things be as they are, and getting curious with what might be different than the way that we assume they might be. So now we're going to take some questions and answers. I'm going to respond to the ones that get submitted to the Q&A box. If anybody has any, now is the time. Absolutely no pressure, but I'm here to answer anything. And if a question arises after this workshop, you can always ask them next week, or you can email them through the Beyond My Battle website, or just to info@beyondmybattle.org. But I'm going to pause and just see if there's any questions. Okay, got our first question. What if you think you should be feeling more stressed than you are? That's quite an assumption. No, I'm kidding. I think that that's really natural. I think that we have this societal perception of what we should feel. And especially this goes back to, like, how were we raised? What was modeled to us as, what the right way to respond to stress is? What is the right way to deal with stress? I think that we're naturally just, like, taught to respond to stress in certain ways through, again, like, our childhood programming or even media and what we see in movies and TV shows. So everybody responds to stress differently. This, the numbness that might come the numbness that might come after being highly stressed is something to take note of. I think it's something to consider these questions that we've been really talking about burnout and how is burnout presented. We talked a lot today about how our physical stress signs and our behavioral stress signs are kind of that the contrast to them, even though they are still in that category, is the turning off, is the shutting down, is the checking out. So as long as we're not checking out completely, I think that we can really work through this process of understanding our triggers. Yeah, and this person went on to say that they feel like they're on autopilot. I would personally try to make some time for self-reflection, for maybe trying journaling or just going outside and getting time for yourself if that's at all possible. Talking to a mental health professional always helps, but I know that's not accessible for everybody. But the autopilot thing, I think, is a sign of burnout. I mean, one of the classic signs of being in caregiver burnout is like not taking any joy in the caregiving experience. Not that it's supposed to be this happy-go-lucky thing, but the complete like not finding any satisfaction in that, or maybe it's spilling over and there's no satisfaction in other areas of life. And yeah, I don't want you to feel like you are alone or that the numbness is something to feel guilt over. We talked about caregiver guilt last week, and that's also really common, feeling like I'm not stressed enough. I am numb, and this is something that's wrong with me. Nothing is wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. You are doing the best that you can. I would work on what we talked about today, really witnessing what are my physical stress signs. And again, if you're so numb that there are no like heightened ones, that numbness is a sign. That numbness is a sign. And maybe there's more subtle physical things that we're not picking up on just yet because we don't want to get curious about them. So really dropping into that state of curiosity, and as well with the behaviors. And again, some of those behaviors are lack of behaviors. Some of those behaviors are just are the checking out or the backing out, or all of that. So I hope that answers the question, and definitely please don't feel alone in that feeling. It's very understandable. And yeah, I would recommend, if you can, writing things out. I mean, it always sounds more daunting than it is to get that pen and paper out. I actually use the note section in my iPhone because I find that my thumbs somehow go faster than a pen and paper these days. and I just blurt out what I'm feeling into the iPhone, or maybe it's on my laptop. That's just me, but a classic pen and paper also, of course, gets the job done, and nobody ever has to see any of that besides you. Okay. Yeah, and I just got a comment here that it's hard to gauge normal now that socialization is so restricted due to the virus. Yeah. There is no such thing as normal, I think. I don't think there's any such thing as normal. We keep hearing this, like the new normal thing. And I guess to some extent, like, yeah, life online has become more normal than social interaction offline. Working at home has become more normal than working in an office. But I think we're just constantly shifting. We are constantly evolving. I do think that getting that level of socialization for caregivers, especially because caregivers so often neglect that connection. Or when we are connecting, maybe we're just pushing away the caregiving stuff and just checking out and numbing out. But we offer at Beyond My Battle a Tuesday night caregiver group for those who are interested in something like socializing with other caregivers. It's not anything super heavy. Caregivers are there with managing all different kinds of caregivers. So we do that in order to not have people drop into just in this case, just ALS, or in my case, just blindness, or in other people's cases, just lupus, or just Crohn's disease. And I find that when that happens, we just get caught talking about the disease. So the caregiver group that we provide on Tuesday nights is all different kinds of caregivers. So you're just talking about caregiving, or who knows, you're just talking about whatever you want to talk about. But it is a great group. It's on beyondmybattle.org under the support tab, and I highly recommend it. I don't run that group. We have a wonderful psychologist, Josh, who runs it. I have one more question here. Yes, and someone asked, is that every Tuesday? Yep, every Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. and it's just 45 minutes. Really, we found that that's the right amount of time. So, yeah. And one last question is: we have experienced that the ALS progression kind of goes like steps. There will be this big change, and while figuring the new normal out, we feel more stressed. Then things level out and the stress level lowers quite a bit until the next big change. Yeah, that is that is so hard, and that is like a great time to see what the triggers are. I mean, I'm just saying, like, what are the when that step goes back up and there's that new step that you need to take, what about that is the most difficult? What about that sets it off? It could just be, the word, it could be that is the trigger, the disease having, and I'm going to use the term flare up. I don't know specifically in the case of ALS what terms you might use in that situation, but in other conditions, the term flare up is often like there's this flare up, or there is this. My best friend has cystic fibrosis, so for her it's like you know and she's received different organs over the course of her experience with CF. So it's like an organ failure type situation. That is a huge thing. But that, every few years there's like this scare of like needing a new organ. So I totally get that, and it can be really traumatic. I find that the practice of releasing expectation for the future and knowing how uncertain the future is. Again, I don't want to sound like dismal here, but that practice, which is often facilitated through mindful, I like to facilitate that through general mindfulness practices that keep us present, that keep us here, that keep us grounded in the here and now, set us up to deal with those massive steps, those I'm using your term here, those massive steps or those big moments or those scary times, much more mindfully. I mean, there's just no other word than that I can think of. Much more calmly, and maybe we're not as shocked to our core or traumatized by those moments because we've practiced the being here now. We've practiced this knowing of impermanence, and it becomes less scary. Honestly, it does. And so if that's something, mindfulness meditation, mindfulness practices are something that we talk about on our website, and that I do in my own life. I have a personal website, happy to talk to people about those kind of practices at any other point. But please reach out through Beyond My Battle if you need to connect with me personally, or are looking for support group services, or are having trouble with any of that. Yeah, those are really great questions. Thank you everyone for answering. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. That is it. We will see you next Monday.